Hey everybody, it's George. So I'm having the same conversation that, well, pretty much anybody in real estate is having right now and continues to have. But I'm having the same conversation with a lot of my clients and then people that we're general contracting for, or even sellers that we're purchasing houses from. So the conversation though that everybody has is, when's the market going to tank? Well, the thing you keep hearing is, it's not going to tank because there's no inventory to sell. So as long as there's not enough supply, the demand will be too high. Absolutely agreed. That is the general condition that we're dealing with. No doubt about it. But in the Northeast, and what you have to look at is that recently there was a publication put out by National Association of Realtors. I can't remember. I think it was them. Anyway, in this publication, which just came out in April of 2023, they were pointing out where prices are moving, and there's a downward trend in pricing in just about the entire country. And so everybody says, well, we're heading for a crash. All right, let's back up for a couple of seconds here, because I said in just about every part of the country. The Northeast is the one area that is really not settling down, cooling off, or showing any sort of reversal. And even when we do see any sort of let's call it a backstep in pricing, because I'm not going to call it a crash, because nowhere is that a justified statement. The Northeast is probably going to have the least amount of downturn in any sort of pricing. And there's a particular reason why. Much of the Northeast, New England areas in particular, and in some cases, I would say probably states like Connecticut, Rhode Island, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, so excluding New York and Massachusetts, although New York's technically not really part of New England in that respect. So those states, though, there's a key difference between those states and the rest of the country. In 2010, when the recession, the Great Recession ended, that knocked us on our ass for a solid 2+ years. When that ended and we started recovering from that, the country as a whole was on an upswing. And there was an appreciation return to goods and services and housing. And what you had was a return on pricing. Now, allow me to give you a little boredom on numbers for a second here. So prior to 2011, so during that crash period, that 2008, 2009, 2010, and the recession really started like December of 2008 is when it really officially kicked in. But for that 2+ year period, prices did absolutely plummet after their peaks in 2006 and 2007 because it was terrible lending. We were writing loans that never should have been written. People were buying houses that had no business buying a house at a price range that they simply could not afford. And so a lot of regulation changed after that. A lot of method change and procedures put in. Okay. So the difference, though, is that for the rest of the country, that recovery started coming out after 2010. It started coming out and making its way up. And so when the pandemic hit in 2020, the majority of the country really had already had the recession recovery. They were in strong economic conditions. Hiring was good. Housing prices were good. Food was at a low cost. Inflation as a whole was down. So there was a lot of growth and there was a lot of advancement in those, economic advancement in those areas. And when the pandemic hit, you had the cost of money plummeting to basically zero for all intents and purposes. You had people getting loans that were 2.5%, 2.75%, 3 1/8. And so, housing just skyrocketed across the country. Again, I'm avoiding talking about the Northeast in particular because this is where I think the Northeast had the biggest difference. And that was the lack of recovery speed compared to the rest of the country. We operate in Connecticut. I can tell you, Connecticut's economy did not rebound at the same pace or even to the same levels, relatively speaking, of course, to the other parts of the country. Connecticut trailed. We saw a massive job loss occur. You could feel it driving down the road. You could feel the absolute reduction in traffic. It was unbelievable. And it went on for years. And in 2018, 2019, we still did not have a strong recovery. We were still economically challenged. And I would say parts of Connecticut today are still very economically challenged. But the housing prices were way off the comparative recession recovery of the other parts of the country. I should be careful with the words way off. It's not like it was, $500,000 off or something like that. But the pandemic changed that. The pandemic spiked housing values because you had people racing out of New York and Massachusetts, specifically New York City and Boston, just piling out of the city. And because of that, it shot up housing values in Fairfield County, New Haven County, Hartford County, even parts of Litchfield County. Those areas just soared during the pandemic. Well, what happened was Connecticut, like a lot of other areas, did not have building taking place because it did not have economic recovery at the same rate that the other parts of the country did. And because it didn't have that economic recovery, builders did not stockpile in our area. Because of that lack of building, if you go back and look at the total number of permits that were issued and requested during that period, again, relative to the population of the state, et cetera and so forth, it is a paltry number compared to the rest of the country. So what do you have? You have a recipe for disaster in that respect in Connecticut. You have far fewer houses being built. You have far fewer people looking for houses. You had far less job growth. So Connecticut just didn't have a recovery. Then the pandemic hits. Money is flowing all over the place. Connecticut is sitting on one of the highest equity ratios in the country. In 2019, it was 13th in the country for home ownership tenure. Out of the country, 13th place. That says a lot. People get here and they stay here. They were also stuck here because they couldn't afford to leave because their house had no value in order for them to sell it at a good price. Well, fast forward, it's 2023 and houses are not staying on the market for anything. The median days on market right now in the month of April, well now it's May, but based on the month of April statistics, 10 days median average for the majority of the state. If you talk to a realtor, their experience will tell you it feels like it's 3 to 5 days. Offers are being written in the tens of thousands of dollars over list price. Sellers are getting offers that have waived not only inspection but appraisal contingencies. So you have this massive amount of demand among a small group of highly qualified buyers. And this gets to the whole thing of, affordable housing. Again, Connecticut was not building. There are building studies that'll show you that for every 10 years, every decade, like 1970, 1980, 80 to 90, 90 to 2000, etc., there was a certain amount of housing being developed. So you had, for example, I think the average was 26.5 million homes were being built per annum, per decade, okay, across the country. In 2010 to 2020, I don't think it was more than 6 million homes in total were built across the country. Connecticut got a very small portion of that. 2020 plus, that hasn't gone up. That hasn't improved by any great stretch. During the pandemic, you just had this rush of housing purchases, but you didn't have this spike in building demand. Well, now you have a spike in building demand, but it's going to be higher end homes because people are looking at what's affordable in terms of being builders. They're looking at the affordability of labor costs, material costs. And if they're trying to do something where they've purchased, say 20 acres and they're going to put up, say, 12 parcels, allowing for, roads and everything else, there's the cost to do that, the regulatory cost to do that is not insignificant. So you have to have a builder who's got some liquidity to them. And the majority of builders that are doing that are building high-end homes. The average home in that range, from what I'm seeing, $550 depending upon the county, $750 in other counties. That's not affordable housing by any stretch. So when we talk about the big, the anticipation of a big collapse coming again, I'm going to turn around and say not only is it an issue of supply and the fact that we just don't have it to meet all that demand, but Connecticut's baseline has been reset. That baseline has been adjusted up now because it didn't have all that appreciation during recovery. It got a ton of money during the recovery period in the form of housing purchases, taxes that went to the state from those purchases, things like that. And then it's had general economic growth and jobs because people moved into the state. So you've got all that development. Well, Connecticut now went like this all of a sudden, and now has a new baseline, and it's not going to retract. You may see some softening of prices for a year, maybe a year and a half, if that. Instead, what you're going to see now is Connecticut has just a new baseline. I'll give you an example. New Haven County, median home price for the month of April. The median home price for the month of April in New Haven County for like a 1,500 square foot, 3-bed, 1.5 bath house, $340,000. Now, it changes by town, of course, but that's the county as a whole. Fairfield County is, I think it's 575 or 6.25 now. I can't remember. I think it's 6.25. But anyway, the point is, in 2018 and 2019, the median price value in New Haven County for Connecticut, the median price value for the same equivalent home was $216,000 in 2018. In 2019, it was $240,000. So you had a $20,000 appreciation 18 to 19 because you finally had Connecticut getting some of that recovery. But in 2020, it just skyrocketed. That median price is not going back $120,000. It's not going down $120,000. So when you look around and say, oh, there's a crash coming, let's just say that housing comes down 10%. So if the median price is $340,000, 10% being $34,000, you're at $306,000 as a median price. That is still, $60,000 over what it was 4 years prior. That is not an insignificant amount of appreciative change. And again, it's because it was a forced appreciation because of pandemic, which just finally gave Connecticut and the Northeast the recovery that it needed. Northeast pricing is still going up for one reason, because it didn't have the building that all the other areas got. So that's back to the supply issue. Hopefully this gives everybody a little bit better understanding of why we're not seeing a downshift in pricing, why we don't think we're going to see a downshift of pricing on any significant level in the coming months, year. I mean, if we have a recession, you will see some price adjustments. That's inevitable. But again, even if it's a 10%, 20%, let's say it's 20%. 20% would be a $70,000 cut off of that median price. No. It is inconceivable to see that much of an adjustment. In 2008, when we had the adjustment from that overpricing, the total, the median drop, again, going by county, the median drop was $30,000. I don't even think that was at that time. I think that was 15%. And that was a housing calamity because of absolutely horrible lending practices and terrible buyers just buying houses way overpriced relative to what they could afford. Today's buyers are way more qualified. Minimum credit score ratings that are required now are at least 100 points higher than they were back then. I think the median credit score was 540 in 2006. Can you imagine having a credit score of 540 and getting a house for $400,000 or $300,000? No bank's going to touch that. No way. Nope. So you had all these things going on at that time. Today, you got to have income that is consistent over a 2-year period of time. You've got to have a credit score that is consistent and shows improvement in particular. Downshifting credit scores raise flags. Then they start to really dive into what's your debt ratio and what's causing that. Lenders are way more focused now because they have to protect it because of the regulation change. They have to protect the deposits that those loans are based against. No, you're not going to see... I can't come up with a logical enough reason or even a financial criteria that suggests we're going to see a fallout like we did in 2008. Again, fundamentally, it's not going to be because of bad loans. It's simply going to be just things being overheated and buyers just not being able to purchase at those prices, and they just retract. which is what did happen. I'm sorry, this video's going on so long. Which is what did happen in 2022, starting in September when mortgage rates really started to bounce upward. You know, you saw a drawback in buyers. Fewer buyers were in the market, absolutely. But they didn't stop. And in the winter pricing period for Connecticut did not have its traditional downshift to the extent that it normally sees during the winter pricing. Normally winter pricing, February being the lowest time of the year. February was not the lowest time of the year in 2023. February was higher in 2023 than it was relative to the prior year. January was actually the low month. So we saw a fast move for purchasing coming out of January when rates were still being hammered. You know, Fed was still doing 50 and 75 basis point increases. People were out buying because one reason. They needed to purchase, wanted to purchase, leases were ending, whatever it may be, whatever their situation was, and they're qualified to make the purchase. So as long as the buyers are out there that are qualified, you're not seeing a clawback on, I'm running late. You're not going to see a clawback on these pricing changes of not of any material value. So anyway, sorry for the long video. If you guys ever have questions, comments, whatever you want to chat about something, please feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to chat. See you guys later.